Laura Bennett woke before dawn on a Tuesday that felt indistinguishable from every other weekday of her married life. The house in Westchester was quiet in the way only suburban homes could be, not peaceful, but suspended, holding its breath between obligations. She lay still beside Andrew, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. He slept on his back now, hands folded loosely over his stomach, as if even rest required order. 10 years of marriage had taught Laura the geography of his body in the dark, the faint scar near his collarbone, the way his brow tightened before waking. None of it stirred her anymore. She slipped out of bed without waking him. Downstairs, the kitchen light hummed softly. Laura poured herself coffee she would not finish and leaned against the counter, staring at the window above the sink. Outside, the lawn glistened with dew, manicured and predictable. This life had shape, routine, a kind of decency. It also had walls she could no longer breathe within. Her phone buzzed. "Julian, I'm downstairs whenever you're ready." She didn't reply. Instead, Laura walked down the hallway to the children's rooms. Ethan was 7, sprawled diagonally across his bed, one arm flung over a pillow shaped like a dinosaur. Claire, barely 5, slept curled inward, her thumb tucked into her fist. Laura stood in the doorway, gripping the frame harder than necessary. She told herself she would come back, that this was not abandonment, only a detour toward happiness she could later share. She told herself children were resilient. She told herself love, real love, justified everything. The lies lined up neatly, rehearsed and ready. On the kitchen table lay a white envelope with Andrew's name written in careful ink. Inside, there was no letter, only her wedding ring. Words felt insufficient, dangerous. She feared if she tried to explain, she might stay. The front door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Julian waited by the curb, leaning against his car, tie already loosened though the workday hadn't begun. He smiled when he saw her, that familiar smile that had once felt like oxygen. "You ready?" Laura hesitated for half a second, then she nodded. "Yes." As the car pulled away, the house shrank in the rearview mirror. Laura didn't look back again. Upstairs, Andrew woke to silence. He noticed the empty space beside him first, the absence before the understanding. He moved through the house slowly, as if afraid of what each room might confirm. When he reached the kitchen table and saw the envelope, he already knew. Andrew sat down, staring at the ring until the coffee went cold. He did not call her. That morning, he packed lunches for the children with shaking hands. He smiled too widely at breakfast. He told them their mother had gone on a trip. He believed, briefly, that if he said it enough times, it might become temporary. Laura, meanwhile, crossed the city line with Julian, heart pounding, convinced she had chosen life. She did not know, could not yet know, that this quiet morning would define every relationship she would ever touch again. New York unfolded itself to Laura like a promise that never stopped moving. At first, that motion felt intoxicating. Julian's apartment sat high above the Hudson, all glass and steel and curated emptiness. Mornings arrived filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight sliding across concrete floors, and minimalist furniture that seemed designed more for admiration than comfort. Laura learned quickly where she was allowed to leave her things: one drawer in the bathroom, half a closet shelf, no photographs on the walls. "This place breathes better without clutter," Julian once said, kissing her cheek as if it were a philosophy rather than a boundary. She laughed then. She wanted to believe that shedding weight, objects, roles, obligations, was the same as freedom. Julian moved through the city with purpose. He worked in private equity, the kind of job that turned everything into potential: companies, people, time itself. Laura watched him from the sidelines of his life fundraisers on rooftops, dinners where everyone wore ambition like a tailored suit, conversations thick with numbers and power plays disguised as charm. At first, Julian introduced her proudly. "This is Laura," he would say, hand warm at the small of her back. "She's figuring out her next chapter." It sounded generous, supportive, but as months passed, the introductions shortened, then stopped. Laura filled her days carefully. She joined a Pilates studio in Soho, learned the barista's name at the cafe downstairs, started freelancing remotely for a lifestyle magazine that paid just enough to make her feel relevant. She curated herself the way the city demanded: sleek, adaptable, unburdened. At night, Julian came home late, carrying the day on his shoulders. They made love less often, but with a kind of efficiency that mimicked his work ethic. Desire was still there, sharp and urgent, but intimacy, the slow unraveling of another person, began to feel like an inconvenience. "You're quiet," Laura said one evening, lying beside him, staring at the ceiling. "Long day," Julian replied, already scrolling through his phone. She turned toward him, resting her head on his chest. His heartbeat was steady, controlled. Not once did he put his arm around her. The city never asked Laura about her children. That silence was both mercy and punishment. No one expected her to explain. No one looked at her with questions sharpened by morality. In Manhattan, reinvention was currency. The past was something you edited, not confessed. Still, there were moments, small, disloyal moments, when Westchester crept back in. A woman struggling with a stroller on the subway, a child's laughter echoing in Central Park. Laura would pause, breath hitching, then keep walking. Julian never asked. He didn't ask about Andrew either. Their shared past existed only as a vague inconvenience, something resolved and therefore irrelevant. Laura told herself this was respect, that he trusted her autonomy. But autonomy, she learned, could feel a lot like isolation. By the third year, Julian's career accelerated the way avalanches do. Quietly, then all at once. He traveled constantly. London, Hong Kong, San Francisco. Laura learned to pack lightly, to adapt her sleep schedule, to wait alone in hotel rooms designed to look identical everywhere in the world. She learned how to be agreeable. "You don't mind if we move dinner? You're okay flying out a day later? You'll understand, right?" Laura always did. At a gala one winter, Julian introduced her to a senior partner's wife. "And what do you do, Laura?" the woman asked, smiling thinly. Before Laura could answer, Julian said, "She's with me." The words landed softly, too softly. Laura smiled anyway, glass of champagne trembling just slightly in her hand. Later, in the car, she said, "You could have let me answer." Julian sighed, loosening his tie. "Why make it complicated?" She stared out the window, city lights blurring into something abstract and unreachable. She had left a life where she was needed for one where she was optional. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. The way Julian forgot her birthday but remembered a client's dog's name. The way conversations circled his ambitions and never hers. The way decisions were made for a future that assumed her presence but never required her input. She became an accessory, beautiful, supportive, interchangeable. When Laura finally asked where they were going, marriage, children, permanence, Julian answered with practiced gentleness. "Why do we need labels? We're good, aren't we?" She wanted to scream that good wasn't the same as secure. Instead, she nodded. She had already sacrificed certainty once. Admitting the cost felt like admitting failure. Years passed. Julian aged into success, silver threading his hair, his confidence calcifying into something untouchable. Laura stayed the same, carefully maintained, quietly fading. She watched friends pair off, build families, anchor themselves to something solid. Then, one evening, Julian came home early. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, not looking at her. Laura recognized the posture immediately. It was the stance of a man delivering a conclusion he'd reached long before. "I think we want different things," he said. The sentence was clean, bloodless. He had met someone else. Not an affair, he insisted, just possibility. Someone younger, someone unburdened by history. Laura listened without interrupting. She had learned that interruptions rarely changed outcomes. When Julian left, he took nothing that looked like a memory. The apartment echoed with his absence. Laura sat on the floor, back against the couch, and waited for devastation to arrive. It didn't. What came instead was clarity, sharp, unforgiving. She had chosen desire over responsibility, freedom over continuity, and now she stood alone, holding a life that had never fully held her back. For the first time in 10 years, Laura thought of home not as a place she escaped, but as something she had abandoned. And for the first time, she wondered if it was already too late to return. Laura came back to Westchester in early October, when the trees were just beginning to betray themselves. From the train window, she watched the city thin out, glass and steel giving way to brick, then lawns, then streets that curved instead of rushed. 10 years ago, this landscape had felt like a cage. Now it looked unsettlingly calm, like a life that had continued without noticing her absence. The station smelled the same: damp leaves, old concrete, coffee from a kiosk that had somehow survived a decade. Laura stood on the platform longer than necessary, her suitcase at her feet, as if waiting for someone to recognize her. No one did. She had imagined this moment countless times during sleepless nights in Manhattan. In those fantasies, returning required courage, but it was rewarded: awkward conversations, maybe anger, but ultimately forgiveness. She had rehearsed apologies in the mirror, shaped them carefully, stripped them of excuses. What she had not rehearsed was invisibility. Andrew's house stood at the end of the same quiet street, freshly painted, the hydrangeas fuller than she remembered. A new car sat in the driveway, practical, sensible, not Andrew's old sedan. Laura's heart pounded as she walked up the path. She noticed details the way one does when stalling: the new porch light, the wind chimes by the door, the welcome mat that said home in cheerful, confident letters. She rang the bell. Footsteps. Laughter. Female. Unfamiliar. Then the door opened. The woman standing there was not what Laura expected. She was close to Laura's age, maybe a few years younger, with soft brown hair pulled back loosely, and an expression that settled into polite confusion. "Yes?" the woman said. Laura swallowed. "I'm looking for Andrew Cole." The woman hesitated only a second. "He's in the backyard. I'll get him." She didn't ask who Laura was. Laura stepped inside without being invited, her body remembering the space before her mind could protest. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something warm baking. A life in motion. Shoes by the door that weren't hers. Framed photos on the wall. Ethan in a soccer uniform. Claire at a piano recital. And in every photo, beside them, was the same woman. Andrew appeared at the edge of the hallway and stopped short. Laura. Her name sounded strange in his mouth, flattened by time, stripped of intimacy. He looked older, broader somehow. His hair was threaded with gray, his face more angular, less open. But his eyes were the same, steady, guarded. "Hi," Laura said, hating the smallness of the word. Behind him, the woman hovered, her presence quiet but unmistakable. "This is Margaret," Andrew said. "My wife." The word landed with a dull, irreversible weight. Laura nodded, forcing a smile. "It's nice to meet you." Margaret returned the smile gently, the way one does when stepping into a moment that doesn't belong to them. "I'll check on the kids," she said, already retreating. "Kids." Laura turned back to Andrew. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," he replied, not unkindly. They stood there, two people bound by a history that suddenly felt inappropriate to reference aloud. Laura noticed how Andrew kept a careful distance, his arms folded loosely, not defensive, but closed. "I'm back in New York," Laura said. "I thought maybe we could talk." Andrew studied her, as if matching the woman in front of him to a version he'd buried long ago. "About what?" "About everything," she said. "About the kids." At the mention of them, something shifted in his expression, not anger, but resolve. "They're doing well," he said. "They have a good life." "I want to see them," Laura said quickly. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but let's not do this on the doorstep," Andrew interrupted. He gestured toward the living room. "Sit." They sat on opposite ends of the couch. Laura perched stiffly, hands folded in her lap like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. She could hear muffled voices upstairs, Margaret speaking softly, a door closing, footsteps moving with practiced familiarity. "So," Andrew said finally, "why now?" Laura exhaled. "Julian and I separated." Andrew nodded once. No sympathy crossed his face, no satisfaction either. "I lost my job shortly after," Laura continued. "I had time to think about what I did, about what I left." "You didn't leave things," Andrew said quietly. "You left people." The distinction cut deeper than accusation. "I know," Laura whispered. "I was wrong." Andrew leaned back, hands clasped. "You were gone for 10 years, Laura. I thought distance would make things easier, she said. I thought you'd hate me less. He almost smiled at that. Almost. You don't hate someone for 10 years, he said. You learn how to live without them. Silence settled between them, heavy and final. I don't expect things to go back, Laura said. I just hope there might still be space for me. Andrew looked toward the staircase, then back at her. They were 5 and 7 when you left, he said. They needed a mother. I was their mother, Laura said, the words breaking free before she could stop them. And they needed one who stayed, he replied. Footsteps came down the stairs. Ethan appeared first, tall, awkward, his face unfamiliar in its maturity. Claire followed, her hair pulled into a neat braid, eyes sharp and curious. They stopped when they saw Laura. Andrew stood. Kids, he said evenly, this is your mother. Ethan nodded politely, like meeting a distant relative. Hi. Claire said nothing. Laura felt something inside her fracture, not loudly, but completely. She had expected resistance, anger, tears. She had not expected replacement. And as she looked at the children, who no longer looked like children, Laura understood with sudden, brutal clarity that she had not returned to a paused life. She had returned to one that had moved on. Laura stayed in a small hotel near the station, the kind designed for people passing through rather than returning. The room smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet, neutral enough to hold no memories. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way Ethan's voice had already deepened, the way Claire had looked at her, not angry, not afraid, just observant, as if assessing relevance. In the morning, Andrew texted her a time. Sunday, noon. We'll have lunch together, all of us. The message felt procedural, managed. Still, Laura clung to it like a lifeline. She arrived early, hands empty at first, then doubled back to the bakery on the corner. She chose pastries she remembered the children liking years ago, even though she knew the memory was outdated. Children changed. Taste changed. Families changed. The house looked alive when she returned, windows open, music playing softly from somewhere inside. Laura rang the bell and waited, heart hammering with a hope she didn't trust. Margaret opened the door. Hi, she said warmly, without surprise. She wore jeans and a loose sweater, flour dusting one sleeve. You must be Laura. The name again. Calm, unpossessive. Yes, Laura replied. I brought... Oh, that's kind, Margaret said, taking the bag naturally, as if receiving offerings from former wives was part of her routine. Come in. Andrew's setting the table. Laura stepped inside and felt it immediately. The difference between a house that had been preserved and one that had been lived in. The furniture was rearranged, softened. There were throw blankets on the couch, half-finished homework on the dining table, a calendar on the fridge crowded with practices, recitals, appointments written in Margaret's handwriting. This wasn't her home anymore. Andrew greeted her with a nod. Thanks for coming. Ethan and Claire sat at the table. Ethan looked up briefly, polite as ever. Claire offered a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Lunch was simple pasta, salad, bread still warm. Margaret moved easily through the kitchen, anticipating needs without asking. She refilled glasses before they emptied, cut the bread into smaller pieces for Claire without comment. Laura watched, each gesture landing quietly but decisively. So, Laura said, forcing lightness, what are you both into these days? Ethan shrugged. Soccer, mostly. I play piano, Claire added. I have competitions. That's amazing, Laura said quickly. I used to. I know, Claire said gently but firmly. Dad told us. Laura faltered. Oh. Margaret met her eyes briefly from across the table. Not triumph, not apology. Just awareness. Conversation moved carefully, like people navigating a room full of fragile things. Andrew asked about Laura's job search. Margaret mentioned the school fundraiser. Ethan talked about college visits. Claire focused on her plate. Laura realized she was the only one trying. After lunch, Andrew took Ethan to the garage to look at something mechanical and loud. Margaret began clearing the table. You don't have to do that, Laura said, standing abruptly. I can help. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Sure. They worked side by side in silence for a moment. Laura's hands shook slightly as she stacked plates. Finally, she spoke. You're very good with them. Margaret didn't look up. They're good kids, They love you, Laura said. It wasn't a question. Margaret set a plate down carefully. They trust me. The distinction mattered. I never meant to disappear, Laura said, words tumbling out now that they'd begun. I thought distance would make things easier. Margaret turned to face her. Her expression was calm, but not soft. For who? Laura swallowed. For everyone. Margaret considered that. It didn't, she said. Not cruelly, factually. Ethan used to sleep with the light on for years. Claire wouldn't let go of my hand the first month I moved in. Laura felt the floor tilt. I didn't know. No, Margaret agreed. You didn't. They stood there, two women bound by the same children, separated by time and choice. Margaret's voice softened slightly. I'm not here to replace you. But you did, Laura said, her voice breaking. Margaret shook her head. I didn't take something from you. I filled what was empty. Claire appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension she didn't fully understand. Dad says we're going to the park. Margaret smiled immediately. Grab your jacket, sweetheart. Claire paused, looking at Laura. Do you want to come? The invitation startled her. It wasn't warmth, it was politeness, extended out of good manners rather than longing. I'd like that, Laura said. At the park, Laura walked a step behind them. Andrew pushed Claire on the swings. Margaret sat on a bench beside Ethan, reviewing something on her phone he'd asked about. Laura hovered near the edge, unsure where she fit. A mother-shaped absence. Claire ran past her laughing, then stopped. You don't know the new rules, she said matter-of-factly. The park changed. Laura smiled weakly. I guess I missed a lot. Claire nodded. Yeah. The word carried no accusation. That was somehow worse. When it was time to leave, Andrew walked Laura back to the driveway. This can't be confusing for them, he said quietly. We'll take things slow. I understand, Laura said. And she did. Too well. As she watched them return inside, Margaret's hand resting briefly on Andrew's back, Claire talking animatedly between them, Laura felt the finality settle in her chest. This wasn't a family waiting for her return. It was a family already whole. And Laura, standing alone at the edge of the driveway, understood that love, when unattended long enough, didn't freeze. It reorganized. Laura learned quickly that redemption, if it existed at all, did not arrive in grand gestures. It lived in the small, almost invisible efforts, messages carefully worded and erased, gifts chosen too thoughtfully, memories offered like fragile antiques no one had asked to inherit. Her first attempt was a text to Ethan. Hi, I saw online that your teen won last weekend. Congratulations. I'd love to hear about it sometime. She read it twice before sending, then set the phone down as if distance might soften the rejection. 3 hours later, a reply appeared. Thanks. Nothing else. Laura stared at the single word until it lost shape. She reminded herself that politeness was not cruelty. Still, it felt like being thanked by a stranger for holding a door. She tried Claire next, emailing because Andrew had said Claire didn't like texting much. I heard you playing at a competition soon. I used to get so nervous before recitals too. If you want, I can help you practice. The reply came the next day. Thank you. Margaret helps me. Laura closed her laptop and pressed her palms flat against the table, breathing slowly until the tightness in her chest eased into something manageable. Margaret helps me. It wasn't a rejection. It was a fact. Undeterred because giving up would mean admitting the truth too soon, Laura began leaving things instead of asking for space. A book Ethan once loved, mailed with a note that said, "Saw this and thought of you." A scarf for Claire in her favorite color, folded neatly, no explanation attached. Andrew texted her after the third package. Please don't send gifts without checking first. It complicates things. Complicates. Another word that sounded neutral and felt like a closed door. Laura shifted strategies. She leaned into memory, the one currency she still possessed. At lunch one afternoon, Andrew had agreed to coffee, alone she mentioned, a camping trip from years ago, the rainstorm, the way Ethan had insisted on sleeping in the tent anyway. Andrew listened politely, stirring his coffee long after the sugar had dissolved. He doesn't remember that, he said eventually. He remembers you leaving. The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. I'm not trying to rewrite anything, Laura said quietly. I just want them to know I didn't forget them. Andrew looked at her then. Really looked. For 10 years they had birthdays you weren't at, school plays you didn't attend, fevers you didn't sit through. You didn't forget them, he said, but they had to forget you. That's how they survived. Laura felt something inside her give way, not break, but bend permanently. She began to notice the patterns she'd once been blind to, how every interaction was scheduled, supervised, time-bound, how Margaret's presence hovered even when she wasn't physically there, an invisible architecture holding the family together. At Claire's piano recital, Laura sat in the back row, invited but clearly peripheral. She watched Margaret adjust Claire's dress before she went on stage, whisper something that made Claire smile. When Claire played, her eyes searched the audience, once landing not on Laura, but on Margaret, who nodded encouragement, steady and sure. Laura clapped until her hands stung. Afterward, Claire accepted Laura's praise politely, then excused herself to join her friends. Laura stood there holding a bouquet she hadn't known whether to bring. Margaret approached. "Thank you for coming," she said sincerely. "I didn't want to intrude," Laura replied. Margaret hesitated. This is their life now. The words were not unkind. They were a boundary drawn without hostility. Laura's nights grew longer. She scrolled through old photos she'd saved but never shared. Ethan missing his front teeth, Claire asleep on her shoulder. Proof, she told herself, that she had once mattered. But memory, she learned, did not translate into presence. One evening, desperate for something concrete, Laura asked Andrew if she could help with college applications, or piano scheduling, or anything at all. "They don't need help," he said gently. "They need consistency." "And I can't be that?" she asked. Andrew didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Not right now." Right now stretched into an undefined future. The final attempt came unexpectedly. Ethan called her. The sound of his voice startled her so much she nearly dropped the phone. "Hi," he said, a little awkward. "Dad said I could talk to you." "Of course," Laura said, heart racing. "I'm really glad you called." There was a pause. I wanted to ask something." "Yes?" "Why didn't you come back sooner?" The question was simple, devastating. Laura closed her eyes. She could give him the truth fear, pride, the slow erosion of courage, or she could offer something easier to carry. "I thought I'd done too much damage," she said finally, "and I was afraid that seeing you would hurt you more." Ethan was quiet for a moment. It hurt anyway. "I know," she whispered. "But," he continued, carefully, "Margaret was there. She helped with everything, so I guess it worked out." "Worked out." Laura forced herself to agree. "I'm glad you weren't alone." "I don't hate you," Ethan added, almost as an afterthought. "I just don't really need you." The honesty was almost merciful. After the call ended, Laura sat motionless, phone still pressed to her ear, long after the line had gone dead. That night she understood what all her efforts had been circling. Redemption was not something you earned with persistence. It wasn't unlocked by apologies or patience. It depended on whether there was space left to receive it. And in this family carefully rebuilt, tightly bonded, there was none. Laura had not been rejected. She had been outgrown. The meeting was Andrew's idea, not a visit, he clarified over the phone. A conversation. Neutral ground. They chose a cafe near the river, bright, public, impossible to dramatize. Laura arrived early and sat by the window, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Outside, people jogged past with headphones in, lives moving forward without ceremony. Ethan and Claire arrived together. Andrew and Margaret stayed outside, close enough to matter, far enough to respect the boundary. Ethan was taller than Laura remembered, his shoulders already carrying the shape of adulthood. Claire walked beside him with quiet confidence, her braid replaced by a loose ponytail, her face composed in a way that felt learned. They sat across from Laura. "Hi," Laura said. "Hi," Ethan replied. Claire nodded. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, it was careful, like people stepping onto unfamiliar ice. Ethan broke it first. Dad said we could say whatever we wanted. Laura nodded. That's fair. Claire studied her, head slightly tilted. You don't look like I imagined. Laura managed a small smile. How did you imagine me? I don't know, Claire said honestly. Older, maybe, or sadder. Laura absorbed that. I've been sad, she said, just not in obvious ways. Ethan leaned back in his chair. We're not here to make you feel bad. I know, Laura said quickly. I didn't ask for this. We know, Claire echoed. Ethan glanced at his sister, then back at Laura. I want to understand something, not to argue, just to understand. Okay, Laura said, bracing herself. Did you love us, he asked, when you left? The question landed cleanly. No accusation, no raised voice. Laura didn't answer immediately. She knew better than to rush truth now. Yes, she said finally. I did. I still do. Claire frowned slightly, not in disbelief, but concentration. Then why wasn't that enough? Laura inhaled slowly. Because I was selfish and confused, and I thought wanting something else meant I was already failing you. That doesn't make sense, Claire said. No, Laura agreed. It doesn't. Ethan nodded once, as if filing the explanation away. When you left, Dad tried to make it normal, but it wasn't. We waited for you. Laura's throat tightened. Then we stopped, he continued. Not all at once, just slowly. Claire picked at the sleeve of her jacket. I don't really remember you, she said. I remember pictures and stories, but when I think of Mom, I think of Margaret. Laura felt the words like a closing door. That doesn't mean I hate you, Claire added, earnest. It just means you're someone else. Someone else. I don't want to take her place, Laura said softly. I know I can't. Ethan met her eyes. That's good, because there isn't a place. The statement was neither defensive nor cruel. It was simply true. Laura nodded, forcing herself to stay present. What do you want from me now? She asked. If anything. The siblings exchanged a glance, a wordless conversation forged by years of shared adaptation. I want honesty, Ethan said, but not promises. I want boundaries, Claire said, so I don't have to guess. Laura exhaled. I can do that. Ethan hesitated. And I don't want you to disappear again. I won't, Laura said immediately. He raised a hand. I'm not asking you to stay like before. Just don't come and go when it hurts. Laura swallowed. I understand. Claire watched her carefully. You might always feel like a stranger to me. I know, Laura said. That's my fault. Claire considered this, then nodded. Okay. The conversation ended not with hugs or tears, but with quiet agreement. When they stood to leave, Ethan offered a brief, awkward embrace. Claire did not, but she didn't step away either. Outside, Margaret waited with Andrew. Claire went straight to her, slipping her hand into Margaret's without looking back. Ethan followed, pausing only long enough to say, Take care. Laura stood alone by the cafe window, watching them walk away as a unit. She felt no anger, no shock, only a profound, settling grief. The children she had given birth to were not hers in the ways that mattered anymore. They carried her absence like a healed bone strong, functional, slightly misshapen. That night, Laura wrote in a notebook she'd started carrying again. They don't need me to disappear. They need me to accept my distance. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was truth. And truth, she was learning, was the closest thing to peace she was going to get. Laura had imagined this conversation for 10 years. In some versions, Andrew shouted. In others, he broke down. Sometimes he confessed that he had never stopped loving her, that Margaret was a comfort, not a choice. Other times, he was cruel enough to justify her leaving in the first place. Reality was quieter. They met at a public garden near the river, a place Andrew often walked during lunch breaks. Autumn had settled fully now. Leaves fell without drama, collecting along the paths like decisions made long ago. Andrew arrived on time, hands in the pockets of his coat. "You wanted to talk," he said. "Yes," Laura replied. "Thank you for meeting me." They walked side by side for a while before Laura spoke again. She needed movement to say what came next. "I keep waiting for you to be angry with me," she said. "I think I'd understand that better." Andrew considered this. "Anger takes energy," he said. "I used it up years ago." She stopped walking. He did too. "Did you ever miss me?" she asked. Andrew didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "I missed the version of you who stayed." Laura closed her eyes briefly. "That's fair. I missed the life I thought we were building," he continued. "But not the uncertainty you brought back into the room every time you questioned it." She nodded. "I thought love was supposed to feel urgent, like something you choose over everything else." Andrew gave a small, almost sad smile. "Love isn't what you choose instead of responsibility. It's what makes responsibility bearable." Laura let the words settle. They explained too much, too late. "I don't want to disrupt what you have," she said. "I just needed to know if there was any part of you that wished things were different," Andrew finished gently. "Yes." Andrew shook his head. "Different isn't always better. Sometimes it's just louder." They resumed walking. "I didn't replace you," Andrew said after a moment. "Margaret didn't step into your shadow. She built something new with the pieces I had left." "I know," Laura said. "She's good." "She stayed," he replied. "That mattered." Laura stopped again. "Do you love her?" Andrew met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The clarity in his voice left no room for interpretation. "And me?" Laura asked, hating herself for needing to hear it. Andrew exhaled slowly. "I care about you. I always will. But the kind of love that builds a life can't survive abandonment. It turns into something else. Memory, habit, responsibility, not hope." Laura felt the last fragile thread inside her loosen. "I thought if I explained myself well enough," she said quietly, "you might understand." "I understand," Andrew said. "That doesn't mean I can go back." They reached the end of the path. The river stretched out before them, wide and indifferent. "There's nothing left to resolve," Andrew said. "Not because it didn't matter, but because it already did what it was going to do." Laura nodded, tears blurring the water beyond. "I'm glad you came back," Andrew added. "The kids needed answers, and so did you." She looked at him, then the man she had once built a life with, now a stranger shaped by choices she hadn't shared. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Not as a plea, as a truth. "I know," Andrew replied. They stood there for a moment longer, two people who had once been everything to each other, now connected only by what they had survived. When they parted, there was no embrace, no promise to stay in touch, only acceptance. Laura walked away with the strange, heavy relief of finality. She had come back looking for Fire Ridge, longing, anything that proved she still mattered the way she once had. What she found instead was something colder and more conclusive. Peace. Laura left Westchester on a gray morning that felt intentionally unremarkable. No one came to see her off. She hadn't expected them to. The hotel clerk wished her a pleasant trip with professional indifference, and the taxi driver asked if she was heading home or away. Laura said, away, then realized she no longer knew the difference. From the train window, she watched the houses receded, porches, trees, driveways filled with lives that continued whether she observed them or not. Somewhere among them was Andrew's house, full of small routines she would never interrupt again. Somewhere were Ethan and Claire, moving forward with the easy momentum of people who had already adapted. The train crossed into the city and New York rose to meet her, crowded, impatient, alive. It had once felt like escape, now it felt like consequence. Laura rented a small apartment in Brooklyn, modest and quiet, with windows that faced another building instead of the river. She unpacked slowly, deliberately. This time she didn't erase herself to fit a space. She hung her own photos. She kept the furniture mismatched. She let the rooms feel unfinished. Work came next. Not the kind she'd chased before, no curated identity, no proximity to power. She took a position editing long-form essays for a nonprofit publication, stories about loss and resilience and people rebuilding lives that had broken loudly or quietly. The pay was modest, the hours were long, the work felt honest. Weeks passed, then months. Laura didn't text the children unless they texted first. She sent birthday cards with simple messages, no gifts, no expectations. Ethan replied sometimes, brief updates about school. Claire sent one email after a competition I played well. Margaret cried. Laura read it twice and smiled, then closed her laptop without answering immediately. She waited. She respected the distance. On weekends, she walked the city. She sat alone in parks, watched families argue gently over snacks and schedules. Sometimes it hurt. Sometimes it didn't. Grief, she learned, was not a straight line. It softened without disappearing. One afternoon in late spring, Laura ran into Margaret by accident. They were both reaching for the same book in a small independent bookstore near the river. Margaret laughed lightly when she recognized her. "Hi," she said, genuine surprise warming her voice. "Hi," Laura replied. The moment felt oddly neutral, stripped of history's sharp edges. They stood awkwardly for a second, then Margaret gestured toward the cafe in the back. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" Laura considered declining, then she nodded. They talked about nothing important at first. The neighborhood, the weather, the bookstore's impending closure. Margaret mentioned Claire's upcoming recital, Ethan's summer plans. She didn't ask Laura for updates. Laura didn't offer them. Eventually, Margaret said, "The kids are okay." "I know," Laura said. "That matters most." Margaret studied her, then smiled softly. "You're different." Laura returned the smile. "I had to be." When they parted, there was no tension, no rivalry, just two women acknowledging the shape of things. Andrew never reached out again. Laura didn't either. Their chapter had closed not with bitterness, but with completion. One evening, months later, Laura sat at her desk, rereading an essay she was editing, someone writing about how they survived a choice that couldn't be undone. The author had ended with a line that stopped her cold. "Some decisions don't ruin love. They redefine it beyond recognition." Laura closed the document and stared out the window, city lights flickering like distant signals. She thought of the woman she'd been 10 years ago. Certain, impatient, convinced that love was something you pursued at all costs. She thought of the woman she was now, quieter, steadier, finally capable of staying with discomfort instead of running from it. She had lost a family, but she had not lost her capacity to understand why. That understanding didn't absolve her. It didn't restore what had been broken, but it allowed her to stop begging the past to behave differently. On the anniversary of the day she'd left, Laura took a walk along the river, alone. The air was cool, the water steady, indifferent to memory. She stopped where the path curved, watching boats drift past, each headed somewhere specific. She whispered, not as apology, not as regret, but as acknowledgement. "I chose." The truth of it no longer frightened her. Some choices rewrote love permanently. They transformed it from presence into absence, from belonging into distance. And sometimes the bravest thing left to do was to live honestly with the version of love that remained. Laura turned back toward the city, carrying nothing with her but what she could hold without harming anyone else. It was not redemption, but it was enough.